Zekthara sat in the cold metal chair and looked at the three beings across from him. The Galactic Peace Commission wanted answers, and he was the only Korthak survivor who had seen it all from the beginning. His forearms shook slightly as he remembered those terrible days when everything the Korthak Empire believed about war and conquest fell apart because of one strange species. The first time Zekthara saw humans was 3 years ago when Admiral Vex Morin led the greatest fleet in Korthak history toward a small yellow star. Intelligence reports said the third planet held a species that had just learned to travel between stars. It should have been easy. The Korthaks had done this same thing 847 times before with 847 different species. Every single one had surrendered. When they saw the massive Korthak warships, Zekthara was there as a war correspondent to record another glorious victory for the Empire. He stood on the bridge of the flagship Dominion as they dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the human solar system. What they found waiting for them changed everything. The humans had only 12 ships compared to the Korthak's 300 vessels. The human ships were small and looked like they were built from scrap metal. Admiral Vex Morin laughed when he saw them through the view screen. The ships were so primitive that they still used chemical rockets for some of their maneuvering. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the lead human vessel called Defiance. When Admiral Vex Morin opened communications, he expected the usual begging and pleading that came from species about to be conquered. Instead, Morrison appeared on screen wearing a simple blue uniform with no fancy decorations. He had short brown hair and calm gray eyes that showed no fear. Admiral Vex Morin began the standard speech that had worked 847 times before. He told the humans that resistance was useless and that immediate surrender would mean better treatment under Korthak rule. He explained that the Korthak Empire was vast and powerful beyond human understanding. He offered the humans the chance to keep their lives if they submitted peacefully. Morrison listened to the entire speech without interrupting. When the Admiral finished, Morrison was quiet for almost a full minute. Then he smiled and said 4 words that Zekthara would never forget. Morrison said, "Come and take it." Admiral Vex Morin was confused. In 847 previous conquests, no species had ever responded with such simple defiance. The Admiral tried to explain again how hopeless the human situation was. He told Morrison that the Korthak fleet could destroy every human ship in minutes. He said that fighting would only bring death and suffering to the human species. Morrison nodded as if he understood perfectly. Then he said something that made no sense to any Korthak on the bridge. He said that humans would rather die free than live as slaves. He said that freedom was worth any price, including death. He said that every human ship would fight until it was destroyed. The Admiral tried one more time to make Morrison see reason. He offered to spare human civilians if the military surrendered immediately. He promised that humans could keep their planet if they accepted Korthak authority. He even offered Morrison a position in the Korthak fleet if he would help convince other humans to surrender. Morrison just shook his head and said that humans had tried being reasonable with bullies before, and it never worked. He said that sometimes you had to punch a bully in the nose even if the bully was bigger than you. Then Morrison said something that made Zekthara feel cold fear for the first time in his life. Morrison said that humans had been preparing for this day since they first looked up at the stars. He said that every human knew that someday they would meet a species that wanted to take their freedom away. He said that humans had spent generations learning how to fight enemies who were stronger and better equipped than they were. Admiral Vex Morin finally gave up trying to talk and ordered the attack. The Korthak fleet moved forward, expecting the humans to run or surrender at the last moment. Instead, the human ships charged straight at the Korthak formation. 12 tiny ships against 300 massive warships. What happened next was the first sign that humans were different from every other species in the galaxy. Instead of trying to preserve their ships, the humans used them as weapons. 3. Human vessels rammed directly into Korthak destroyers and exploded. The explosions were so powerful that they took out 6 more Korthak ships. The remaining human ships fought like nothing Zekthara had ever seen. They ignored damage that would have forced any other species to surrender. Human ships kept fighting even after they lost weapons and engines. One human vessel continued attacking using only emergency thrusters, and a single damaged cannon. Captain Morrison's ship Defiance was the last human vessel still fighting. It had lost half its hull and was leaking atmosphere, but Morrison refused to surrender. Admiral Vex Morin personally targeted the Defiance with the flagship's main weapons. The human ship exploded in a ball of fire that lit up the darkness of space. The battle was over, but Admiral Vex Morin did not feel victorious. The humans had destroyed 18 Korthak ships and damaged dozens more. No species had ever inflicted such losses on a Korthak fleet before surrendering. The admiral kept staring at the wreckage of the human ships and asking himself what kind of species would fight so desperately for something as meaningless as freedom. Zekthara knew that the admiral was thinking the same thing that every Korthak on the bridge was thinking. They had won the battle, but somehow it felt like they had lost something important. The humans were dead, but their defiance seemed to hang in the space around them like a ghost that would not rest. That was when they received the transmission from the human planet. A woman's voice came through the communications system and told the Korthak fleet that Earth had received Morrison's final message. She said that every human on the planet now knew that the Korthaks could be hurt and that freedom was worth fighting for. She said that the real war was just beginning. Zekthara closed his eyes and tried to forget what he had witnessed during the invasion of Earth, but the memories would not leave him alone. The Galactic Peace Commission needed to understand what made humans so different from every other species. The Korthaks had conquered. The answer was simple and terrifying at the same time. Humans fought for ideas instead of survival. After the space battle, Admiral Vex Morin ordered the invasion of the human home world. Intelligence reports said Earth had a population of 8 billion humans with only basic military technology. The Korthak ground forces had conquered planets with much stronger defenses. General Morgoth led 2 million Korthak warriors in the largest planetary assault in Empire history. The humans were commanded by General Lisa Hayes and Admiral Robert Kane. Zekthara had studied their military records and found nothing impressive. Hayes had spent most of her career fighting small wars between human nations. Kane had never commanded more than 50 ships at one time. Neither of them had any experience fighting an advanced alien species. What Zekthara did not understand was that humans had been practicing for this war their entire history. Every human conflict had taught them something about fighting enemies with better weapons and superior numbers. They had learned that victory did not always go to the strongest army, but to the army that wanted to win the most. The first sign that something was wrong came when Korthak dropships landed in human cities. Instead of civilians running in panic, the humans fought back with whatever weapons they could find. Old humans and young humans stood side by side throwing rocks and bottles at Korthak soldiers. Even human children helped by carrying ammunition to the fighters. General Morgoth could not understand why human civilians would risk their lives to fight trained warriors. In every other conquest, civilians had hidden until the fighting was over. The Korthak military doctrine was designed to fight other armies, not entire populations. When everyone became a soldier, the rules of war stopped making sense. The human military used tactics that no civilized species would consider. They hid weapons. In schools and hospitals, they dressed soldiers like civilians and civilians like soldiers. They used children to carry messages and supplies through battle zones. Every human settlement became a fortress that had to be taken building by building. Commander Steve Rogers led the defense of a human city called New York with only 300 Marines against 10,000 Korthak warriors. Instead of meeting the Korthaks in open battle, Rogers divided his force into small groups that attacked and disappeared. The Marines used the city itself as a weapon, turning every street into a trap. Zekthara watched from a command ship as the battle for New York lasted for 6 weeks. The Korthaks had superior weapons and armor, but the humans knew every hiding place in their city. Marines would appear from sewers and subways to attack Korthak patrols, then vanish before reinforcements could arrive. What disturbed Zekthara most was how humans treated their wounded and dead. Korthak doctrine said that wounded soldiers should be left behind if rescuing them would endanger the mission. Dead soldiers were just bodies that took up space and resources. Humans thought differently about their fallen comrades. Sergeant Amy Collins became famous throughout the Korthak army for something no logical being would do. Her unit was retreating from a lost position when Korthak forces overran a field hospital full of wounded human soldiers. Collins could have escaped with her men, but instead she stayed behind to fight a delaying action. Collins held off an entire Korthak battalion for 6 hours, using only a damaged rifle and whatever ammunition she could find on dead soldiers. She was not trying to win the battle or save the hospital. She was buying time for other humans to remove their wounded and dead before the Korthaks could capture or desecrate the bodies. When Collins finally ran out of ammunition, she continued, fighting with a broken piece of metal until Korthak soldiers overwhelmed her position. The tactical value of her sacrifice was minimal, but the effect on human morale was enormous. Every human soldier who heard the story fought harder because they knew their comrades would never abandon them. General Morgoth tried to use human emotions against them by threatening to execute prisoners unless human forces surrendered. This strategy had worked on dozens of other species who valued individual lives over military objectives. Humans responded by fighting even more desperately to prevent their soldiers from being captured alive. The psychological warfare that worked on other species made humans angrier instead of more afraid. When Korthaks broadcast images of destroyed human cities, the humans used the pictures as recruitment tools. When Korthaks threatened human families, the humans fought like wild animals to protect them. Fear made other species surrender, but it made humans more dangerous. Admiral Kane developed a strategy that confused every Korthak commander. Instead of protecting human ships and bases, Kane used them as bait to lure Korthak forces into ambushes. Human vessels would appear to be damaged or lost, then suddenly reveal hidden weapons when Korthak ships moved to investigate. The humans had learned something that the Korthaks did not understand. Sometimes the best way to win a war was to make the enemy think you were losing. Human commanders would sacrifice entire fleets to destroy single Korthak superweapons. They traded space and ships for time and information. Captain Ben Taylor pioneered the most frightening human tactic that Zekthara witnessed. Taylor trained special units called berserkers who deliberately entered combat in controlled rage states. These soldiers ignored pain and fear and continued fighting even when they should have been dead from their wounds. Korthak battle computers were designed to predict enemy behavior based on logical decision-making. When humans stopped being logical, the computers became useless. Berserker units would charge directly into Korthak positions without regard for casualties or tactical advantage. The sight of humans fighting like mindless animals terrified Korthak soldiers who had never seen such behavior. The worst part for Zekthara was realizing that humans were not actually mindless when they fought. They were making calculated decisions to trade their lives for strategic advantages. A human soldier might sacrifice himself to destroy a single Korthak vehicle if that vehicle was important enough to the battle. General Hayes used this human willingness to die for abstract concepts as her greatest weapon. She convinced human soldiers that their deaths would inspire other humans to fight harder. She told them that future generations would remember their sacrifice and be grateful for their freedom. Somehow this made humans eager to die instead of afraid. By the end of the Earth invasion, General Morgoth had conquered the planet but lost half his army doing it. Every human city had been turned into rubble, and every human military unit had been destroyed. But the humans had proven that the mighty Korthak Empire could be hurt, and that knowledge was spreading to every world in the galaxy. Zekthara knew that Admiral Vexmoran and General Morgoth were making the same mistake that Korthak commanders had made 847 times before. They thought that conquering the enemy homeworld meant the war was over. But humans had taught their children that home was not a place but an idea, and ideas could not be conquered by force. Zekthara rubbed his temples with 2 of his 4 hands as he continued his testimony to the Galactic Peace Commission. The third phase of the war was when the Korthak Empire realized they were not fighting a normal species. Humans had a talent that terrified every advanced civilization in the galaxy. They could learn and adapt faster than any being had a right to. After conquering Earth, the Korthak High Command expected the human resistance to collapse within months. Humans had lost their homeworld and most of their military forces. Logic said they should surrender or at least retreat to lick their wounds. Instead, the humans did something that no other species had ever attempted. They got better at war. Dr. Richard Stone led a team of human scientists who had escaped Earth before the invasion. They studied every piece of Korthak technology they could find, including wreckage from the space battles and equipment left behind by occupation forces. Within 6 months, the humans had not only figured out how Korthak weapons worked, but had built improved versions. The first sign of human adaptation came when Korthak patrols started losing contact with their base ships. Investigation teams would find patrol vessels completely destroyed by weapons that should not have existed. The energy signatures matched Korthak plasma cannons, but the power levels were impossible for human technology to achieve. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos was responsible for the psychological warfare that made Korthak soldiers afraid to sleep. Santos had studied Korthak biology and discovered that their hearing was more sensitive than human ears. She used this knowledge to create sonic weapons that could drive Korthak troops insane with frequencies that humans could barely hear. Santos would broadcast human war songs and battle cries across Korthak communication channels during night operations. The sounds were designed to trigger fear responses in Korthak brains while inspiring human fighters to greater fury. Korthak soldiers began reporting nightmares about human voices calling for revenge from beyond death. The psychological attacks became so effective that Korthak commanders had to rotate their troops off front-line duty after only weeks of exposure. Entire Korthak units requested transfer to other sectors rather than face the human psychological warfare. Some Korthak soldiers suffered permanent mental damage from exposure to human sonic weapons. Captain Ben Taylor expanded his Berserker program into something that violated every rule of civilized warfare. Taylor discovered that humans could enter combat trance states that made them immune to pain and fear. These Berserker units would attack Korthak positions while screaming ancient, human war cries that froze Korthak blood. The Berserkers painted their faces with human blood and wore the bones of dead enemies as decorations. They carried primitive weapons alongside advanced firearms because they wanted to kill Korthaks with their bare hands. The sight of humans charging into battle while howling like wild animals broke the morale of veteran Korthak troops. Zekthara had seen recordings of Berserker attacks, and they still gave him nightmares. Humans would run directly into Korthak energy weapon fire without trying to take cover. Wounded Berserkers would continue fighting even after losing limbs or suffering injuries that should have killed them instantly. The most terrifying thing about the Berserkers was that they were not mindless savages. They used sophisticated tactics and coordinated attacks while appearing to be out of control. Human commanders would use Berserker units to distract Korthak forces while regular troops flanked the enemy positions. Dr. Stone made the breakthrough that changed the entire war when his team reverse-engineered Korthak shield technology. The humans did not just copy the Korthak designs, but improved them by combining alien science with human engineering. Human shields became stronger and more efficient than the original Korthak versions. Human innovation accelerated beyond anything the Korthaks thought possible. Ships that should have taken years to design and build were appearing in battle after only months of development. Human factories were producing weapons and equipment at rates that defied economic logic. Commander Alex Turner led human engineering teams that specialized in battlefield improvisation. Turner's crews could build functional weapons from scrap, metal, and spare parts in hours instead of days. They created mobile factories that could be broken down and moved when Korthak forces got too close. The humans had learned to fight a different kind of war than any species the Korthaks had faced before. Instead of trying to match Korthak firepower directly, they used speed and creativity to stay ahead of Korthak technology. Every time the Korthaks developed a counter to human tactics, the humans changed their methods. Human ship designs became so unpredictable that Korthak battle computers could not track them effectively. Some human vessels were built to look like cargo ships until they opened hidden weapon ports and revealed massive artillery. Other ships appeared heavily armed but were actually fast scouts designed to gather intelligence. The humans started using Korthak tactics against the Korthaks themselves. They captured enemy ships and modified them with human weapons and shields. Human crews would use captured Korthak vessels to approach enemy formations, then reveal their true identity at point-blank range. Captain Peter Clark pioneered the human strategy of total war that confused every Korthak commander. Clark's engineering units would destroy infrastructure not to harm civilians, but to force Korthak occupation forces to waste resources on humanitarian aid. The humans had weaponized compassion itself. Korthak doctrine required occupying forces to maintain basic services for conquered populations. When humans destroyed power plants and water treatment facilities, the Korthaks had to divert military resources to prevent civilian suffering. This gave human resistance fighters more opportunities to attack weakened Korthak positions. The strategy worked because Korthaks could not understand why humans would create problems they then helped solve. Human saboteurs would destroy a bridge, then help Korthak engineers repair it, while gathering intelligence about enemy capabilities. The humans were fighting a war inside a War Admiral Kane developed the fleet tactics that finally gave humans space superiority despite being outnumbered 10-1. Kane realized that human ships did not need to be stronger than Korthak vessels if they could be smarter and faster. He trained human pilots to think like pirates instead of Navy officers. Human fleets would appear in multiple locations simultaneously, using tactics that seemed impossible. Korthak admirals would receive reports of human attacks in star systems that were light years apart and happening at the same time. The humans had learned to use physics itself as a weapon. The turning point came when Dr. Stone's team created the first human superweapon using modified Korthak technology. The weapon could destroy entire Korthak battle groups with a single shot. But humans used it differently than any other species would have done. Instead of targeting enemy fleets, they used it to destroy Korthak symbols of power. Human forces used the superweapon to destroy the Korthak monument on their first conquered world. The monument had no military value, but its destruction sent a message to every enslaved species in the galaxy. The message was simple, but revolutionary. It said that Korthak power was not absolute and could be challenged. Zekthara realized that the humans had turned the war from a military conflict into something much more dangerous. They had made it a war of ideas where victory went to whoever could inspire others to fight for their beliefs. The Korthaks were fighting to maintain their empire, but humans were fighting to destroy the concept of empire itself. The scariest thing about human innovation was that it never stopped improving. Every battle taught them something new about warfare that they immediately shared with other human units. The humans treated war like a science where failure was just another form of data to be analyzed and used. By the end of the third phase, human technology had advanced centuries beyond what should have been possible in such a short time. The species that had been using chemical rockets just months before was now building weapons that could challenge the greatest empire in galactic history. Zekthara paused in his testimony to the Galactic Peace Commission and stared at his hands. The fourth phase of the war was when everything the Korthak Empire believed about military superiority and technological advantage proved to be wrong. It was when a species that should have been extinct started winning battles they had no right to win. The moment Zekthara knew the war was lost came during the Battle of Kepler Station. Admiral Kane's human fleet had been defending the station for 3 months against overwhelming Korthak forces. Intelligence reports said the human fleet was down to less than 30 ships and was running out of ammunition, and Fuel Admiral Vex Morin personally led a massive Korthak battle group to finish off the human resistance. The attack should have been a simple cleanup operation against desperate survivors. Instead, it became the greatest military disaster in Korthak history and the beginning of the end for the Empire. The human fleet at Kepler Station fought exactly as Korthak strategists expected. They used hit-and-run tactics to slow the Korthak, advance but gradually fell back toward the station itself. Admiral Kane's ships took heavy damage and several were destroyed in the fighting. Everything suggested that the humans were making their last stand. Admiral Vex Morin moved his entire fleet into position to destroy the station and end human resistance in that sector. The Korthak ships formed a massive battle line that stretched across space like a wall of death. Every weapon was targeted on the remaining human vessels and the station they were defending. That was when Admiral Kane revealed the trap he had been preparing for months. The damaged human ships suddenly accelerated toward the Korthak line while broadcasting a signal that activated hidden weapons placed throughout the asteroid field around Kepler Station. The asteroids themselves became missiles guided by human remote control. But the real surprise came from behind the Korthak fleet, where space itself seemed to tear open and reveal dozens of human warships that should not have existed. The ships emerged from a nebula that Korthak sensors had dismissed as empty space. The humans had been building a secret fleet using debris from previous battles. Admiral Kane had spent months convincing the Korthaks that his forces were trapped, and desperate while actually preparing the largest ambush in military history. The human ships that emerged from the nebula were not just rebuilt versions of destroyed vessels, but entirely new designs that incorporated the best of human and Korthak technology. The battle became a massacre, but this time the Korthaks were the victims. Caught between the station defenses and the surprise fleet, the Korthak formation collapsed into chaos. Ships that had been hunting humans for months found themselves surrounded by enemies who knew every weakness in Korthak armor and shield Zekthara. Watched from the flagship as Admiral Vex Morin tried to rally his forces, but the humans had learned to think like Korthaks while keeping their own unpredictable nature. Every time the Admiral attempted to reorganize his battle line, human ships would appear in impossible locations and destroy key vessels. The humans had turned the Korthak advantage in numbers into a disadvantage by making it impossible for Korthak ships to support each other. Individual human vessels would challenge entire Korthak squadrons to single combat, then lead them into killing zones where other human ships waited in ambush. Admiral Kane himself appeared on the communication system as the Korthak fleet burned around them. He told Admiral Vex Morin that humans had been studying Korthak tactics for months and had learned to predict every move the Empire would make. He said that Korthaks fought like machines, but humans fought like artists. The defeat at Kepler Station cost the Korthak Empire over 200 ships and their most experienced admiral, but the psychological impact was even worse than the military losses. For the first time in Empire history, a Korthak fleet had been completely outmaneuvered and destroyed by an enemy that was supposed to be primitive. Colonel Nicole Wright led the next human operation that proved the war had entered a new phase. Wright commanded a special forces unit that had been training for months to assault the Korthak fortress world of Mordecai. The planet was protected by orbital defense platforms, and a garrison of 50,000 Korthak warriors. Intelligence said that Mordecai was impregnable and that any attack would require a fleet of at least 500 ships to have any chance of success. The humans had fewer than 50 vessels available for the operation. Military logic said the attack was impossible, but humans had stopped following military logic. Wright's assault force used a combination of stealth technology stolen from captured Korthak ships and human innovation to approach Mordecai undetected. The ships were disguised as space debris and moved so slowly that Korthak sensors dismissed them as natural objects drifting through space. The landing force consisted of only 300 human soldiers against 50,000 Korthak defenders. The odds were so hopeless that Korthak commanders did not even bother to increase security when they detected the human infiltration. They assumed it was a desperate suicide mission that would fail within hours. Wright proved them wrong by doing something no military commander in galactic history had ever attempted. Instead of attacking military targets, her forces went after Korthak cultural sites and monuments. Human soldiers destroyed museums and libraries while avoiding enemy troops whenever possible. The psychological impact of losing their cultural heritage was devastating to Korthak morale. The garrison troops had been trained to defend military installations, but they had no protocols for protecting art and history. Many Korthak soldiers abandoned their posts to try to save irreplaceable artifacts. Wright's strategy was based on human understanding of what truly mattered to a civilization. Military bases could be rebuilt, but cultural identity could not be replaced once it was destroyed. The humans had weaponized the Korthak love of their own history and traditions. Captain Peter Clark's engineering corps had developed the tactics that made Wright's mission possible. Clark had realized that humans did not need to defeat Korthak armies if they could make the armies defeat themselves. His teams specialized in creating chaos that forced enemies to waste resources, solving problems. Clark's crews would destroy civilian infrastructure like power plants and communication networks, then immediately offer to help repair the damage. While Korthak engineers worked alongside human technicians to restore services, the humans were actually gathering intelligence and planting surveillance devices. The strategy confused Korthak commanders, who could not understand why humans would create problems they then helped solve. The humans were fighting a war where destruction and construction happened simultaneously. Every act of sabotage became an opportunity for espionage. The most brilliant part of Clark's tactics was that they turned Korthak efficiency against itself. The Empire prided itself on maintaining order and providing services to conquered populations. When humans disrupted these services, the Korthaks had to divert military resources to humanitarian missions. Human resistance fighters would destroy. A hospital then helped Korthak medics treat the wounded while secretly mapping enemy medical supplies and procedures. They would sabotage food distribution centers, then assist in relief efforts while learning about Korthak logistics and supply chains. Admiral Kane used the intelligence gathered by Clark's teams to plan attacks that seemed impossible. Human fleets would appear at exactly the right time and place to intercept Korthak supply convoys or reinforcement columns. The humans always seemed to know where Korthak forces would be before the Korthaks knew it themselves. The turning point in space combat came when human pilots started using Korthak psychology against enemy crews. Human ships would broadcast messages, in perfect Korthak language, claiming to be reinforcements or giving false orders. Confused Korthak vessels would lower their shields or change course based on fake communications. Captain Susan Blake pioneered the human tactic of attacking enemy morale instead of enemy ships. Blake would challenge Korthak commanders to single combat over communication channels while broadcasting the conversations to entire enemy fleets. She would insult Korthak honor and courage until enemy captains made tactical mistakes trying to prove their worth. The humans had learned that Korthaks valued personal reputation above strategic advantage. Blake would trick enemy commanders into fighting duels when they should have been coordinating fleet movements. Individual Korthak captains would break formation to engage human ships in single combat, while their squadrons fell apart around them. By the end of the fourth phase, human forces were winning battles through superior intelligence and psychological warfare rather than firepower. They had turned the Korthak Empire's greatest strengths into weaknesses by understanding how Korthak minds worked better than the Korthaks understood themselves. Zekathara realized that humans had achieved something no other species had ever managed. They had made the Korthak Empire afraid of its own shadow. Zekathara felt his voice shake as he reached the part of his testimony that still gave him nightmares. The fifth phase of the war was when humans revealed their most terrifying characteristic. They did not just fight for their own survival, but for abstract concepts like justice and freedom that applied to species they had never even met. The transformation began when human intelligence discovered the true scope of the Korthak Empire. Captain Alex Turner led reconnaissance missions that mapped Korthak territory and found evidence of dozens of enslaved species scattered across hundreds of worlds. The humans learned that Earth was just the latest conquest. In a campaign that had lasted thousands of years, most species would have used this information to plan their own escape or negotiate better terms for surrender. Humans did something that no logical being could understand. They decided that their war against the Korthaks was no longer about human survival, but about liberating every enslaved species in the galaxy. General Lisa Hayes announced the new human war aims in a broadcast that reached every corner of Korthak space. She said that humans would not stop fighting until every species was free to choose its own destiny. She promised that human forces would fight alongside any people who wanted to throw off Korthak rule. The announcement was military suicide, and everyone knew it. Fighting to defend Earth was difficult enough, but trying to liberate an entire galaxy was impossible for a species that had barely learned interstellar travel. The smart strategy would have been to negotiate a peace treaty that guaranteed human independence. Instead, humans did what they always did when faced with impossible odds. They found a way to make the impossible happen through sheer determination and creative thinking. Commander Turner began recruiting resistance fighters from enslaved species and teaching them human guerrilla tactics. The first alien species to join the human cause were the Villani, who had been enslaved by the Korthaks for over 2 centuries. The Villani were natural engineers who had been forced to build Korthak weapons and ships. Turner's team taught them how to sabotage their own work without getting caught. Villani workers began building flaws into Korthak equipment that would only become apparent during combat. Ship engines would fail at critical moments, and weapon systems would overheat when fired continuously. The sabotage was so subtle that Korthak quality control never detected it until it was too late. The psychological impact of unreliable equipment was devastating to Korthak morale. Soldiers who had always trusted their superior technology began to doubt whether their weapons would work when they needed them. Fear of equipment failure made Korthak troops hesitant and cautious in battle. Turner's liberation strategy worked because he understood something about oppression that the Korthaks had never considered. Enslaved species had been watching their masters for generations and knew every weakness in the Korthak system. They just needed someone to teach them how to exploit those weaknesses. The Zephyrian resistance was led by a former slave named Kith Ara, who had worked in Korthak communication centers for 50 years. Kith Ara knew every code and protocol used by the Empire. She taught human operatives how to intercept and decode Korthak military communications. Human intelligence suddenly became perfect because they were receiving real-time information about every Korthak troop movement and battle plan. Admiral Kane could position his fleets to intercept enemy forces before the Korthaks even left their bases. The Empire's communication network became a weapon pointed at itself. The Horvathi joined the rebellion after Turner's team helped them recapture their sacred breeding grounds on the moon of Torval. The Horvathi were fierce warriors who had been broken by centuries of slavery, but remembered their proud military traditions. Human trainers taught them modern tactics to combine with their natural fighting instincts. Each species that joined the rebellion brought unique skills and knowledge that made the human cause stronger. The Trilaxians were natural pilots who could fly ships through asteroid fields and nebulae that would destroy any other crew. The Omnari were living computers who could hack Korthak systems faster than electronic warfare programs. Admiral Susan Blake coordinated the multi-species fleets that began appearing throughout Korthak territory. Blake had learned to think like each alien species while maintaining human unpredictability. Her fleet compositions were impossible for Korthak strategists to counter because they combined the best tactics from dozens of different military traditions. The rebellion spread faster than the Korthaks could contain it because humans had taught enslaved species that revolution was contagious. Every successful liberation inspired other worlds to rise up against their oppressors. The Korthak Empire found itself fighting dozens of separate wars simultaneously. What terrified Zechithera most was watching Korthak soldiers realize that they were no longer fighting for conquest, but for survival. The rebels were not trying to build their own empire, but to destroy the concept of empire itself. They wanted to create a galaxy where no species could dominate others. Human psychological warfare evolved to target the conscience of individual Korthak soldiers, rather than their fear. Captain Blake would broadcast messages explaining that Korthak troops were fighting to preserve slavery and oppression. She asked them whether their families would be proud of what they were doing. Some Korthak units began refusing orders to attack civilian targets or suppress slave rebellions. Military discipline started breaking down as soldiers questioned whether they were fighting for honor or just maintaining an evil system. The Empire's greatest strength had always been absolute obedience, but humans had weaponized doubt the breaking. Point came when human forces liberated the Korthak prison world of Nexus Prime, where the Empire kept political prisoners from across the galaxy. The planet held representatives from every species the Korthaks had conquered, including several who had been imprisoned for over 1,000 years. Turner's Liberation Force consisted of human special operations troops, working alongside volunteers from dozens of species. The attack was coordinated perfectly, using intelligence provided by former slaves who knew every detail of the prison's layout and security systems. The liberation of Nexus Prime was broadcast across the galaxy and showed enslaved populations that the Korthak Empire could be defeated. Former prisoners who had become legends in their own cultures returned home to lead resistance movements. The psychological impact was impossible for the Empire to counter. Dr. Richard Stone developed the weapons that made large-scale rebellion possible by creating technology that could be manufactured by primitive industrial systems. Stone's designs allowed enslaved species to build effective weapons using basic materials and simple tools. The rebellion became self-sustaining because humans had taught other species to think like humans. Every act of resistance inspired more resistance until the Korthak Empire was spending more resources suppressing rebellions than fighting the human military. Admiral Kane's final strategy was to offer every Korthak soldier and civilian the chance to join the rebellion and help build a better galaxy. He promised that humans harbored no hatred for individual Korthaks, but only opposed the system of oppression they had created. Some Korthaks began defecting to the human cause and providing intelligence about Empire military plans and weaknesses. The defectors were treated as honored allies rather than conquered enemies. Humans had learned that forgiveness was more powerful than revenge for winning hearts and minds. The most devastating blow to Korthak morale came when Turner's intelligence network discovered that the Empire had been lying to its own people about the nature of their conquests. Korthak civilians had been told that they were bringing civilization to primitive species, not enslaving advanced cultures. When the truth about the Empire's crimes was broadcast throughout Korthak space, many civilians began demanding that their government end the war and free the enslaved species. The Korthak military found itself fighting a war that its own people no longer supported. Zechithera realized that humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had turned a war of conquest into a war of liberation that united dozens of species against a common enemy. The Korthak Empire was not just losing battles, but losing the moral authority to exist. The humans had proved that freedom was not just a human concept, but a universal desire that could inspire any species to fight against oppression. They had weaponized hope itself and turned it against the greatest empire in the galaxy. Zechithera took a deep breath and prepared to tell the Galactic Peace Commission about the end of the war that changed everything. The final phase began when human scientists, led by Dr. Marcus Webb, accomplished something that should have been impossible. They found the location of the Korthak homeworld, which had been hidden for over 10,000 years. The discovery came through a combination of human ingenuity and information provided by Korthak defectors who had joined the rebellion. Dr. Webb's team analyzed hyperspace navigation data from captured ships and traced the routes back to their point of origin. The Korthak Empire's greatest secret was finally revealed when Admiral Kane received the coordinates for the Korthak home world. Every human commander expected him to order an immediate attack. The planet was defended by the most powerful weapons in the galaxy, but humans had proven they could overcome impossible odds through determination and sacrifice. Instead, Kane did something that no military leader in galactic history had ever attempted. He sent a message to the Korthak High Command, offering them complete amnesty in exchange for the immediate liberation of all enslaved species and a treaty guaranteeing galactic freedom for every sentient race. The offer was delivered by General Kevin Ross, who volunteered to travel to the Korthak capital world without weapons or escort. Ross walked alone into the chambers of the High Command, carrying only a data pad containing the human peace proposal. His message was simple but revolutionary. Ross told the assembled Korthak leaders that humans had not wanted this war but were prepared to finish it on their own terms. He explained that human forces now controlled most of the galaxy, and that the Empire existed only because humans allowed it to continue existing. The general offered the Korthaks a choice between surrender with honor or complete destruction of everything they had built over thousands of years. He promised that humans would dismantle the Empire piece by piece until nothing remained but the memory of what it could have been. The Korthak High Command listened to the human proposal with growing horror as they realized the true scope of their defeat. Intelligence reports confirmed that human-led rebellions had succeeded on over 300 worlds. The Empire's military was fighting dozens of separate wars and losing all of them. Ross explained that humans could have destroyed the Korthak home world months earlier, but had chosen restraint because they believed in giving their enemies the chance to do the right thing. He said that humans preferred to win through mercy rather than massacre. The offer included terms that no conquering species had ever proposed to a defeated enemy. Korthaks would be allowed to keep their home world and maintain their culture as long as they renounced imperial expansion and slavery. Individual Korthaks who had committed war crimes would face trial, but the species itself would not be punished. What shocked the High Command most was that humans were offering to help rebuild the worlds damaged during the war, regardless of which side had caused the destruction. Ross said that humans believed in healing rather than revenge and wanted to create a galaxy where former enemies could become allies. The Korthak leadership spent days debating the human proposal while their empire collapsed around them. Some commanders wanted to fight to the death rather than accept defeat from a primitive species. Others argued that surrender was the only way to preserve their civilization. The final decision came when news arrived that human forces had liberated the last major Korthak stronghold and that Admiral Kane's fleet was approaching the home world. The High Command realized that further resistance would only result in the complete destruction of their species. Chancellor Morthak delivered the official surrender in a ceremony broadcast throughout the galaxy. He acknowledged that the Korthak Empire had been built on oppression and slavery and formally apologized to every species that had suffered under Korthak rule. The surrender document was signed by representatives from every liberated species in what became known as the Galactic Freedom Accords. The treaty established principles of self-determination and mutual cooperation that would govern relationships between species for generations to come. What amazed Zekthara was that humans immediately began helping their former enemies rebuild their shattered worlds. Human engineering teams worked alongside Korthak technicians to repair damaged infrastructure. Human medical personnel treated wounded Korthak civilians with the same care they gave to their own people. The psychological impact of human mercy was more devastating to Korthak pride than any military defeat could have been. Warriors who had been prepared to die fighting found themselves receiving aid from the enemies they had tried to destroy. Admiral Kane established the Galactic Peacekeeping Force with representatives from every species, including former Korthak, officers who had proven their commitment to the new order. The humans insisted that lasting peace required former enemies to work together as equals. Dr. Webb's scientific teams began sharing human technology with all species, regardless of their role in the war. The humans had learned secrets during their struggle for survival that could benefit every civilization in the galaxy. The transformation was so complete that within months, former slave worlds were sending aid to Korthak planets that had been damaged during the rebellion. Species that had been enemies for centuries were cooperating to build a better galaxy for everyone. Zekthara concluded his testimony by explaining why the Korthak Empire had truly lost the war. The humans had not defeated them through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through moral superiority and the power of their ideals. The interviewer from the Peace Commission asked Zekthara what made humans different from the 847 other species the Korthaks had conquered. His answer had haunted him since the day General Ross walked unarmed into the high command chambers. Zekthara said that every other species had fought to survive, while humans fought because they believed in something worth dying for. The Korthaks had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of war, but humans had mastered something far more powerful. He explained that you cannot defeat an enemy who considers death in service of their ideals to be victory rather than defeat. When humans decided that freedom was more important than life, they became unstoppable because they had nothing left to lose. The final question asked whether Zekthara believed the peace would last, or if humans would eventually build their own empire to replace the Korthak system. His answer surprised everyone. In the chamber, Zekthara said that humans had taught the galaxy something that no species had understood before. True power came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to know when not to use that power. He pointed out that humans could have enslaved every species in the galaxy, but instead chose to liberate them. They could have built the greatest empire in history, but decided to create a system where empires could never exist again. The war correspondent who had witnessed the rise and fall of the greatest military power in galactic history ended his testimony with words that would be remembered for generations. He said that humans had won the war, not by becoming better at fighting, but by proving there was something better than fighting. Zekthara told the commission that the humans had given the galaxy its greatest gift by showing that even the most primitive species could achieve greatness through courage and compassion. They had proved that hope was stronger than fear and that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The old Korthak looked at his interviewers and said that he hoped they would remember the lesson humans had taught through their blood and sacrifice. Sometimes, the most advanced species was not the one with the best weapons, but the one with the strongest principles. As Zekthara left the hearing chamber, he thought about the human memorial that had been built on the site of the first battle where Captain Morrison had said, "Come and take it." The inscription simply read that courage was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. The memorial reminded every visitor that humans had faced the greatest empire in galactic history, with nothing but 12 small ships and the unshakable belief that freedom was worth fighting for. They had proved that sometimes David really could defeat Goliath if David refused to give up.